Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, July 15th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, online scam networks hide behind layers of accounts, infrastructure, and payment systems. A recent DOJ operation shows what it takes to find them. Plus, you can't defend critical infrastructure from threats you can't detect. That's becoming a growing concern in space. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Defense Department is pausing the rollout of contractor cybersecurity requirements. DoD's top IT official says the current iteration of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program is too onerous on small businesses. She's now leading a review of the CMMC program to consider the next steps. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with the latest on this update. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This sounds like a big surprise. Was it news to the industry that CMMC program was going to be just sort of instantaneously stopped?
Yeah, I think this is fair to say it was a bombshell for people who watch the CMMC program, even those who watch it closely. Because while we knew new DoD CIO Kirsten Davies had been kind of reviewing the CMMC program, she's been in the seat for only about 6 months. And so she had told lawmakers that she would do this review. They weren't quite expecting what we saw this week, which is a suspension of the CMMC requirements that were set to take effect this November. Those requirements would have essentially mandated third-party cybersecurity assessments across all contracts involving sensitive but unclassified information. These assessments have been going on kind of a voluntary basis. If a DoD program thinks that they need a third-party CMMC assessment, they can include that in their program. But it's just gotten off the ground really in the last year. And now it is being, quote, suspended. DoD is going to conduct a review of the CMMC program. And there's a lot of questions about where this goes next.
There was a lot of momentum in the industry to move towards compliance. What is DoD putting forward as their argument about why it suddenly needs a new review?
Essentially, Davies thinks that the current CMMC program, and especially these requirements for third-party assessments, conflicts with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Acquisition Transformation Initiative. That initiative is focused on eliminating bureaucracy, enabling innovation, enabling non-traditional contractors. And in a memo, Davies writes that the CMMC program imposes, quote, significant and often prohibitive burdens on the defense industrial base, particularly small and non-traditional businesses. She says that while cybersecurity is essential, administrative compliance cannot come at the cost of warfighting capability and defense industrial base growth. And so Davies has clearly taken a look at CMMC, the requirements for third-party assessments specifically, and sided with folks like the Small Business Administration. SBA has been kind of arguing both publicly and behind the scenes for a while that CMMC, this requirement for an assessment of a company's cybersecurity practices, would be too costly. The estimates, depending on who you ask, vary widely, but it could be as little as $50,000 to many hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get an assessment of your cybersecurity practices and whether they meet DoD requirements. And so SBA was actually quoted in this press release that DoD put out. SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler put out her own statements thanking DoD for taking this step. So this has clearly been driven by folks like the Small Business Administration who have been raising these concerns about compliance costs.
But Justin, there doesn't seem to be anything new here. I mean, the CMMC went through the whole rulemaking process. DoD had the chance to consider all of those comments. Secretary Hegseth's acquisition reform agenda isn't new either. So what is DoD hoping to uncover in a 60-day review?
Yeah, it really seems like they're going to be looking at a lot of the same questions that past CMMC leaders have looked at as they built this program up. So Davies has set up a 60-day review. She calls it a top-to-bottom review of the CMMC program, and it will be led by a review and reform task force that will look at how the cybersecurity approach can align with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Acquisition Transformation Initiative. The mandate of the task force is to provide recommendations that prioritize speed to capability, lower barriers to entry for small, medium, and non-traditional businesses, and replaces, and again I'm quoting here from the memo, prohibitive third-party compliance models with scalable, realistic security measures. And so you read between the lines there, the whole point of CMMC has really been to do third-party compliance. So what will this task force come up with after just 60 days, after years of rulemaking? We don't quite know, but they're clearly looking for a different answer.
It feels like maybe the balance of power is shifting between the compliance and security folks and the access side of the conversation.
I think that's right, because as you mentioned, this isn't a new argument when it comes to CMMC. For as long as the program has existed, there have been concerns about cost and compliance. This program has been in the making since 2019, really specifically, and it's meant to audit whether contractors are following existing cybersecurity standards. Those cybersecurity standards are not being suspended. They are still a part of contracts, but up to about this point, contractors have been able to essentially just self-attest to meeting them. And the whole point of CMMC has been to do these third-party audits to check whether the contractors are actually doing them.
So how should contractors behave during this 60-day suspension?
Well, good news is there is a request for information, so they can make their voice heard through responding to that RFI from the Defense Department. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of conversations that happen both internally and I'm sure externally in the next 2 months about the path forward here. The CMMC Review and Reform Task Force includes the Acquisition and Sustainment Directorate at the Pentagon, includes the CIO's office and several other offices. So there's kind of a really kind of cross-body task force here that's looking at this. But, they already went through rulemaking on this, so it'll be interesting to see the mechanics of how they try to change things, if they do significantly try to change things, because as we talked about, they're suspending a program that's already in motion. The contracting rules were finalized last year. The self-assessment requirements for CMMC specifically have already been mandated to start, and those are going to continue under Davies' direction here. But these third-party certification requirements, which everybody had kind of been ginning up for starting this November, are under suspension, and it's unclear when and if those will move forward.
And if you're one of those third-party audit firms, what happens to you?
That's a huge question. The DoD has set up a cyber accreditation body. This is a nonprofit that DoD set up through essentially a no-cost contract to oversee this ecosystem, as they call it, of third-party auditors that this DoD and the cyber accreditation body essentially built from the ground up, because there isn't an assessment regime that exists like this today. And so these third-party auditors have been built over years. People have invested money. You can see if you go to LinkedIn, there's a lot of consternation from those folks specifically about the future here, because they've invested time and money and staff and resources in building up capacity for third-party audits. And it's unclear whether there will be much demand for that on the back end of this review. If you read between the line of Davies' memo, she doesn't seem to think much of this whole idea of third-party certification to begin with. So what happens to all those folks? Only time will tell with this review, but they are certainly feeling in a very tenuous position right now.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, I feel like you and I are going to have several more conversations about this topic.
We certainly will. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story on federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, online scam networks hide behind layers of accounts, infrastructure, and payment systems. A recent DOJ operation showed what it takes to find them. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal investigators say online scam networks operate like organized enterprises, spanning platforms, payment systems, and even countries. A recent operation worked to disrupt that ecosystem all at once, not just in individual accounts. Joining me now to explain how that works is Mike Sweeney, Director of Preemptive Cyber Defense at Silent Push. Mike, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Terry.
We're going to talk about a recent U.S. Department of Justice joint operation called Operation Disruption Week. It happened back in May, and the report is that it took down 1 million accounts tied to scam networks targeting Americans. From your vantage point, what has changed here? What kinds of scams are these that can now operate at that level of scale?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So these scams are what you would have seen in the past. They're romance scams. They're impersonation of law enforcement using deep fakes in order to get you to think that something has happened to a loved one. There's a lot of cryptocurrency investment fraud, different investment schemes that people who are trying to make a quick buck fall into to try to get themselves some financial security. And I think that what really has changed and why the Scam Center Strike Force was stood up is because it just has been industrialized to the level that it has really affected a large amount of people globally. They have, again, just found safe havens within different countries to be able to build out a robust infrastructure physically and get a bunch of workers there and start just, again, scaling up these type of scams. And so the Disruption Week was about going out there and saying, hey, for all those people that have been scammed, you're not unseen, and that we're going to go out there and we're going to start hitting away at these different locations where all these different scammers are being housed to steal money from us.
I just want to read some statistics from that report because I think it's mind-boggling. 1.4 million fraudulent accounts, pages, and groups on Facebook and Instagram, blocking 20,000 Microsoft accounts, disconnection of thousands of Starlink terminals, and private companies froze over 3.8 million in cryptocurrency. This is massive. As you were saying, what infrastructure does it take to operate at that level?
It takes these compounds. They're building out these large buildings that have a massive amount of infrastructure there, like you would think it for a corporation headquarters. And they're setting them up right over the border from Thailand in different countries like Myanmar and Cambodia. And they're sort of falling within a gap of jurisdiction where certain governments aren't capable of enforcing or unwilling to enforce against them. And so Thailand and other countries, the US, are having to step in and find ways to sort of resolve this via sanctions, via international pressures, and via these takedowns, utilizing industry and their access to all the different services that these malicious actors are using to pull money from folks. And so from there, that's really where my company Silent Push had to play, right? We work mostly on cyber threat intelligence and design, and so we helped facilitate detecting some of these operations for that takedown, and the locations for some of these takedowns and arrests. So yeah, it's absolutely massive. Those numbers are this is just a subsection. We focused Southeast Asia within this disruption event, but it's a global problem. It's interconnected. It's an international problem. And one of the stats I've read recently from GASA.org was that it's into trillions now in damages, as large as maybe third in global economies compared to us in China. So it's gotten to a point that we really do need international involvement, local involvement, and a very holistic approach to this, because it's not just Americans and Europeans getting harmed in this. These scam centers, they also do a lot of people trafficking. They exploit the folks to even get to work with them. So they put out job ads and they lure them over, and these scam compounds are prisons essentially. They can't get out. And so it's so many levels of wrong, really. I mean, you're thinking of sort of the phone calls and the virtual scamming, but also the victims there that are forced to do the jobs in the first place. It's a real terrible scene. And so they've found ways to trick people on all sorts of levels to build out this criminal industry that's sitting in these haven countries.
Mike Sweeney is a former NSA cyber and intelligence analyst and now director of preemptive cyber defense at Silent Push. Mike, not only did you describe the actual operation there, but the complexity of the takedown approach, international collaboration, government and industry collaboration. What does it really take to put together a team that can cross all of those boundaries and effectively operate?
It takes a lot of planning, right? But really, it takes understanding the different pain points that you can push on these organizations and the supporting organizations to get the behavior to stop, right? And so as you look across industry and governmental partnerships, you have to look at where we can actually apply pressure by taking away the finances, by creating sanctions, by exposing the problem to particular governments, leveraging governments that have agreements with the countries that are havening this type of activity, and understanding that the organization itself that is conducting these operations to try to go upstream, right? You don't want to, like I said, the workers themselves are often victims, and so the approach of just arresting everyone that's there or just bombing these locations or something, that's sort of out of the picture, right? So you have to sort of take these nuanced approaches of drilling in and sort of getting to the head of these organizations, right? And so I think that's why it's so complex and why we need to bring in as many partners as possible for this. It's massive. We can't let it scale outside of the scope of what we can enforce globally, right? So it's scaled massively. And with that, we've just noticed that it's not just a government problem. It's not just one government problem. It's not just one sort of isolated geographical region. It's a very complex issue with a lot of money involved, a lot of damages being done, and something has to be done about it. So yeah, that's kind of that's why we've kind of approached it the way it's being approached.
And you're working on the analytics side of this. How do you actually find these networks in the first place to then begin to strategize on how to take them down?
So it's often because of how large these organizations are and how large the scam operations are that, just like in a regular industry, things get outsourced. And when things get outsourced, fingerprints are put on things or specific techniques are isolated out, right? And so when the scams have gotten to the state that they've gotten, there's patterns that emerge. That's essentially how you highlight it. You can find commonalities, high commonalities across all this different scam infrastructure and detect it and take it down. And then hopefully, because of the way they've set up their infrastructure, hopefully that infrastructure sits in a particular country that can enforce those type of takedown mechanisms. So again, just like having someone in a particular region that it's hard to arrest them, there is also virtually places where it's hard to take down their infrastructure or to stop the virtual aspect of it. So that's essentially what we do. Is we not only can look across their what are called TTPs, their tradecraft, and then from that you can establish patterns and do large detection across it. And then from there you supplement that virtual takedown with arresting individuals on top of freezing and removing finances, on top of political support, and then any other extra pressure point that we could expose and push ultimately to hopefully collapse the system that is currently attacking everybody right now.
It sounds like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole.
So whack-a-mole is like only, I would say it's more of a game of sort of a labor of love, because, whack-a-mole is if the repetitive process was not something that you can see the benefit of that repetitive action, right? I want to just always sort of highlight that there's a very big moral issue here that is being addressed. It is the fact that we are telling these organizations that you can't get so big that we won't do anything about it, that if it gets too complicated that we can't create a plan in the scenario to harm you and stop you from exploiting folks. And at the end of the day, when everyone's sitting in their house and they want to feel safe when they pick up their phone or when they turn on their TV or use their computer, it is important that the different governments and industry are doing something about these actions, right? And so the whack-a-mole is sort of like a statement that I'm always pushing back against, because it is just this repetitive action that the next mole is going to pop up, right? And I just don't believe that, because another thing is that it sort of defeats the nuance that this is an evolution. Every time we do a takedown operation, every time we plan, we pull in industry, we attack different pressure points. These are evolutions, and every operation, if you look at it close enough, it is moving us closer and closer to our goal of being able to stop this type of activity at this scale.
Mike Sweeney is a former NSA cyber and intelligence analyst and director of preemptive cyber defense at Silent Push. Mike, I appreciate you not only sharing the operation with us, but bringing us back to the Moral Center. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, before policymakers can improve border security, they need confidence in how they're measuring it. But first, you can't defend critical infrastructure from threats you can't detect, and that's becoming a growing concern in space. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Satellites support everything from communications to navigation, making them an increasingly important part of national infrastructure. But protecting those systems depends on being able to identify suspicious activity before it becomes a larger problem. For a look at DHS research in this area, Federal News Network's Eric White discussed these efforts with Ernest Wong, technical lead at the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate.
A lot of this growth is being driven by what's called Space 2.0, or the commercialization of space. And we are seeing the dependencies change. So previously it was more position, navigation, and timing, which people primarily get through GPS. And just from GPS alone, that has dependency on most of our 16 sectors. But now with Space 2.0, we're seeing these dependencies grow into communications, like satellite communications, as well as Earth observation for anything from agriculture to things like maritime domain awareness. So these dependencies are only going to continue to grow, which means that the importance of cybersecurity and cyber resilience for space systems is also going to grow, and something that we need to address. And one of the big challenges we have is recovery when it comes to recovery on board satellites, because unlike on the ground, we can't go in there with a gold disk and just reimage everything. So there's a lot of challenges in operating with space, and those are some of the things that we're trying to mature out more. I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Onboard threat detection. That was the key word that I took away from what you guys put out. What exactly does that mean, and how important is it to not just fixing the problem, but finding it in the first place?
Right. And so detection, when we think about the functions you need for cyber resilience, if you can't detect the threat, you can't really do the other actions after it, which are response and recovery. And so right now, the way cybersecurity is done on space systems is primarily done on the ground through telemetry, and various organizations have demonstrated exploits of attacks that you cannot detect through telemetry. So we have a big gap when it comes to on-orbit detection. So a lot of what we're doing is to try and develop that body of knowledge to first get at that initial step of on-orbit or on onboard detection. And then we can move into things like autonomous response and recovery.
So tell us about Aerospace Sparta framework. What exactly is it, and what does it include, and how can the people with satellites up in space actually utilize it?
So we probably can't talk about Sparta framework without first going into what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, because the Aerospace Sparta framework is basically like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but for spacecraft and satellites. So for the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for people that are not familiar, is a matrix of attack techniques, so like TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures for how an attacker might compromise their system. So it has a number of steps, from things like reconnaissance to initial access to then lateral movement and then eventually exfiltration or impact to the system. And so it's very useful to understand how someone might compromise your system so you can know how to defend it. So the Aerospace Sparta framework is basically like that, MITRE ATT&CK, but for space systems. And we're incorporating a lot of the products that we're developing into the Sparta framework because that's something that people in this industry use a lot anyway. And we're trying to take it beyond just a listing or matrix of attack techniques, but also include things, actionable information that you can use to actually defend yourself, like what sort of cyber threat indicators you look for when it comes to detection. Or if you are trying to understand how to get started, there's also a list of prioritized countermeasures that are also on the website for the Sparta framework.
We're speaking here with Ernest Wong with the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate. And yeah, this is all open to the public, open source. It seems as if it is constantly growing. Is the idea to sort of create a national vulnerability database specifically for space cybersecurity, or what kind of impact are you looking for this to have across the space industry?
Sure. And just to be clear, both the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the Sparta framework are not necessarily data of specific vulnerabilities. They're a catalog of general techniques that are known. And so it's not implementation specific. It's not vulnerability specific. But all these things that we're trying to do is to try and develop the body of knowledge to enable space cybersecurity for space systems, because it's a pretty nascent domain right now when it comes on orbit security. So we're trying to develop all these things like, how do you actually detect, like where do you start with detecting things on board the satellite? And then we're also working on, and going to be publishing soon, various prototypes that can help people understand, or at least look at a reference implementation of how you might take these cyber threat indicators and implement them into actual onboard detectors that you can then integrate into your satellite. And the last thing is, the overall goal here is to lower the cost of security and lower the barriers to adoption for industry, because what we often hear is that security comes at the cost of mission. We're trying to make that cost as low as possible by developing all this, doing the research and the prototyping up front, and hopefully that'll make adoption easier.
Is that the biggest challenge as well in actually implementing this kind of stuff? Other than what you're hearing about, hey, this costs a lot and it may not be worth it for us to send up a piece of new technology if we can't protect it once it's up there. Are there other challenges to implementing cybersecurity measures to a growing field of space technology?
There's, I think, a couple challenges. The first is, we kind of already alluded to it, is that it's a nascent field and the body of knowledge is still being developed. So you need all the various cybersecurity researchers and engineers to be basically fleshing this knowledge out, this pool of knowledge of how do you actually detect and implement and prove it out through prototyping and things like that. So it's maturation of cybersecurity for space systems, which is probably the first challenge. But the next biggest challenge is, as you're just saying, it's adoption because of cost. And in space in particular, you have a lot of constraints, whether it's size, weight, power, but also cost. And so it'll, I think, improve in time because the hardware is improving. There are various projects to improve compute on board satellites, but there is still always going to be this concern about, well, if you do security, you're not doing something else. And we've seen how that turns out on the ground with all the major cybersecurity hacks we've seen, right? And in space, the potential impacts are much greater in terms of, if even if it's inadvertent, if you cause a satellite to lose control and cause a collision, that'll be a bad day for space, right? So we don't necessarily want to wait for the impacts to start happening before cybersecurity is implemented on orbit. So we're trying to deal with that all now. And I think part of getting at this is thinking about it from the supply and demand perspective. We're trying to help with the supply portion in terms of being able to develop cybersecurity in a way that is feasible and also as low cost as possible. But you also need the various customers and operators to be also generate a demand signal to the satellite manufacturers. Say, hey, this is important to us. We'd like to see this in the next batch of satellites.
Are you able to share any of the initial feedback that you've received regarding aerospace Sparta framework, or is it still too early and folks are still getting a grip on it?
We've already received some pretty good feedback. So the aerospace Sparta framework is an aerospace product. We didn't create it. It's aerospace's framework, but we've been adding to it with things like indicators of behavior, IOBs, which are those cyber threat indicators, and also those prioritized countermeasures, which we published, I think 2 or 3 months ago. But we've already seen a number of commercial companies use these products like the IOBs, and that basically enabled them to develop commercial security. That allowed them to develop commercial security solutions. And so there's been a number of different companies we've engaged with, from space system operators to manufacturers to startups even. So we're getting some pretty good engagement, and it does seem like people are doing some interesting things with these products so far. And so we're hoping when we put out this open source prototype in next month or a month or two, whenever we publish it, that will also be the next step for companies.
Ernest Wong is with the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, before policymakers can improve border security, they need confidence in how they're measuring it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Border security may be one of the government's most visible missions, but measuring what's happening along the border is far more complicated. A new GAO report examines whether DHS's metrics and reporting practices are giving Congress an accurate picture of performance. Spoiler alert, the short answer is not really. And Heather McLeod, Director of Homeland Security and Justice at GAO, is here to walk us through the details. Heather, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me today.
Border security is one of the government's highest profile missions. Why does GAO keep coming back to something that sounds much less dramatic, the quality of the metrics? This is your 4th report on this topic.
Yes, this is an important topic and an important report. The report gives Congress a consistent set of measures to examine over time if DHS includes quality information in that report.
What is the risk when policymakers are relying on incomplete or inconsistent measures?
Well, to understand the effectiveness of DHS's investments in border security, these metrics have the potential to give Congress quality information.
Well, Congress required DHS to report 43 border security metrics. Where does the department currently stand in terms of meeting that requirement?
Our most recent report found that DHS's report contained 40 of the required metrics.
Of those 40, though, about half of them you indicate are not computed the way Congress required them to be computed.
Correct. And this is the DHS report contains information from the components within DHS, such as CBP, Coast Guard. And what we found is that those measures that are defined in law for DHS to report aren't exactly in alignment with what the components are providing to DHS for this report.
And so how big is the difference? Is it material?
It could be. I mean, it's laid out in the requirements for the report what's to be in there. And so it could lead to confusion when the department is calling this a specific measure. Congress might understand it to be something different than what the data actually represents. So it could lead to a gap in understanding on what the metric itself is.
What did you find as the biggest gaps in that data collection or data reporting process?
Well, we have a a few outstanding recommendations related to DHS's reporting in this area. For our most recent report, we did not make any new recommendations, but we do have 6 open recommendations to the department related to various aspects of its border metrics report. For example, to help improve the quality of the information in the report, we've recommended that DHS develop and implement a process to systematically review the reliability of data. So that goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of what Coast Guard or CBP or components are providing. We're recommending that DHS make an evaluation of that underlying data.
DHS, from its beginning, was a consolidation of 20 or so different agencies, all with their own independent systems. Is that part of the underlying issue here, that DHS doesn't really have a coherent agency-wide system of collecting data?
Well, GAO certainly has a wide range of recommendations related to data across DHS components. We haven't evaluated, what they have, what kinds of systems DHS itself has to sort of roll up that information that I'm aware of, but we certainly have identified issues with the underlying data systems.
Heather McLeod is a director for Homeland Security and Justice at GAO. Heather, the report really points to this broader issue of data quality and transparency, and we're talking about federal data in a variety of other circumstances in other segments on this show. So what kind of weaknesses did you find in the information that underlies these reports?
Our reviews have also highlighted that DHS could improve the quality of information in its reports by systematically assessing data reliability and communicating the relevant limitations. That is, what the data contained in its report does and does not represent.
And Heather, Homeland Security has an Office of Homeland Security Statistics. How are they playing into all of this collection of data and the provision of the report?
Correct. DHS's Office of Homeland Security Statistics, which is responsible for developing this report that is part of our review, has taken some steps to engage with DHS components. Such as working with the various components and making sure that they're being as clear as possible about the data that the office is looking for versus what the components themselves are producing.
And have you seen them making progress toward data reconciliation?
We continue to follow up on our recommendations all across the areas in these reports, and DHS does continue to make some progress in these areas and continues to agree with our recommendations and take steps to address it.
One of the other things the report points out about this Office of Homeland Security Statistics is that it's using a statistical model to estimate some of the metrics related to unlawful entries in the U.S., but that you're not really confident in the validity of the statistical model and its predictive qualities.
Correct. That is one of our outstanding areas of recommendation, and assessing or updating the current model could help ensure that it remains predictive and reflects current conditions, such as an increase in efforts and activity at the southwest border.
So again, they're looking at bringing in an alternative model that's been developed by Customs and Border Protection. How do you feel about the validity of that model, and would it replace the other one?
We have not had the opportunity to evaluate that model.
You mentioned a couple of times that GAO has not made any new recommendations in this report, that 6 of your 8 previous recommendations are still outstanding. At this point, what will you be looking for to see if DHS is really making progress here? Because again, it brings us right back to where we started. This is such an important policy area. We want to make sure everybody's got the same valid measures that they're considering as they think about future policy.
Correct. We'll be looking for DHS to engage with the components to ensure that the metrics, the data being reported, correspond with the definitions in law that they are to be reporting. We'll also be looking to DHS to implement a more robust process for reviewing the reliability of the data, potentially starting with their next report.
One of the comments in this report is that DHS could re-engage with members of Congress to try to renegotiate some of these metrics so that there is more alignment on the understanding of them, but maybe also an easier collection method to ensure consistency. Have you seen any engagement there, or are you hopeful that that's a path forward?
That is certainly a path that the department could take. The requirements for this report were laid out in a 2017 law, so there is potential that there are more relevant measures at this point. And since DHS hasn't fully reported on all of them, there might be an opportunity for DHS to work with Congress to get what they think are relevant measures at this moment in time.
And do you have a sense that Congress understands that what they've asked for might not be what they're being given back in terms of the data from DHS, and does it matter?
We have engaged with members of Congress about our report and certainly, summarized our findings. So I think, folks do have a sense of what we've been reporting in and some of the gaps between the expectations and what is being reported.
Heather McLeod is a Director for Homeland Security and Justice at GAO. Heather, thanks so much for joining us today and walking us through this report.
Thanks again for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Adversaries are using open source information to target federal missions. That's partly because of a surge in publicly available data and AI tools that can make use of that data more quickly than ever. But agencies can use the same kinds of information to help defend themselves through the tradecraft of open source intelligence. Garen Lacey is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and Technology Security at the State Department, and Eric Miller is a Senior Advisor for Open Source Intelligence at the Defense Intelligence Agency. They talked about OSINT with Federal News Network's Jason Miller. Lacey speaks first.
Our Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security is a huge proponent of using open source. Now, when we talk about open source, it's an ocean of data that's out there. We are getting better and better at understanding what that ocean looks like. And this is the spot where I think we let people that are good at open source be good at it. A lot of our private partners have already cracked this code in using open source intelligence, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of that collection. Now, where the automation comes in is we are extremely proficient at assessing our own vulnerability posture internally. Cybersecurity vulnerability, physical security vulnerability, technical, CI, insider threat. We collect tremendous amounts of vulnerability data from inside our own environment. And I think the key where the technology really helps us that's available is that ocean of open source intelligence without internal context is noise. We spoke earlier about really triaging that to make sure that the actual threat intel is actionable. Now we have to take that and enrich it with our own vulnerability information to understand where the actual risk is. And being able to tie that ocean of threat together with the vulnerability means that an attack chain that exists in another environment, an attack chain that exists in commerce or treasury or another agency that's opened up by one vulnerability may produce a completely different attack chain specific to our environment. That's where actionable comes, not just for the defender, but for the disruptor who looks to break an attack chain before the chain is exploited. And that ties back to that focus, getting ahead of the bad guy, being able to predict once this vulnerability is made available, where does that attack chain exist in my environment? And it may not be the particular vulnerability that I remediate that breaks the chain. It may be somewhere else. And that's where that professional, that person that knows my environment, that adversarial scientist combines with the vulnerability scientist to dictate to us where the most efficient way is to disrupt that activity before it happens.
Yeah, and I think from a DIA perspective, with respect to all source analysts in cyber too, I mean, OSINT is something that all analysts have access to, and they are using it, right? So it's one element, one thing in their quiver that they can use as they're trying to get at a particular data set. or a particular issue, if you will. I think what we also see is if an analyst is starting a new project and they don't really know what to do, start with OSINT. That's actually how we're training people to start, right? Start with OSINT, that's your baseline. Then you can start to understand the context with which we're trying to understand that classified information and where we want to go. So that's a key part of what we're trying to do. The other thing I wanted to take a moment just to highlight is, the organization that I represent now has changed a little bit. So now I work at a place called the National Digital Exploitation and OSINT Center, or NDOC. This is the merger from last year as part of the department's efficiencies drills to find efficiencies. We merged our open source center with our media exploitation center. And I say that because part of what we want to get at with OSINT writ large is how to fuse all this information together. And we're really excited about where we launched this thing 1 October of last year, and now we've really been starting to gain momentum in terms of how we can move this thing forward. On the front end, we've got OSINT collectors that are doing their work, and they're pairing up and partnering with media exploitation specialists and putting all that information together, because the goal as this collection discipline is to create product that enriches and helps people do their job. And the more data we can bring together to give a fuller picture, that's a much better way to do it. On the back end, we are kind of IT data heavy, so we're looking at ways to leverage each other's kind of expertise to be better at that moving forward.
The reason why that integration happened, beyond the efficiency calls and stuff like that, is so much open source is being pulled from media. And we use the very broad term of media, even though it kind of gives me a little, it makes me a little sick inside to say it. But like anything that's in the social media world, anything that's in, even the dark web is now media, because so much people have access to it. Versus if we talk about media 30, 40, 50 years ago, it's a much different perspective. Is that's what drove this in the other piece of it?
It's a key part of it, right? I mean, because basically we're both data heavy and we do a lot of IT work. The media exploitation experts, this all started after 9/11. These are people that were kind of ripping phones, laptops, whatever it is, trying to get access to information. They've got a lot of tools available to them that understand facial recognition, that can understand deep fakes. These are all things that we're going to need to leverage more and more in the OSINT realm.
And if I could add to that, right, Jason, you hit on why it's important. The adversaries right now, they live in the open. They live in the open. They live just beneath the noise floor. They hide in plain sight. From the cyber standpoint, they leverage public infrastructure, right? They leverage, publicly available internet service providers. So where they are actually staging, prepping, building, and doing their reconnaissance is all out in the open. And what they're banking on is that there's so much noise out there as so many people become so reliant on technology that those signals are going to sit just below that noise floor. And it's the reason that the initiatives like DIAs are so important, right? Those breadcrumbs are there and they exist. We just have to find them.
For years, the complaint from folks like maybe Leidos or others, and we won't pick on you, so to speak, but was that it was always a one-way. We gave you information, but you never gave it back. It sounds to me like, Aaron, that you guys are much more comfortable giving back, and you've set up those, to your point, the private sector companies that do work overseas, you have a specific approach. Is that part of why this open source intelligence is now we can talk about it more, we're more comfortable with it, has really grown?
I think as a collective in the community, we've done a good job at removing the stigma behind cyber breaches. The idea that, oh no, a breach happened, we should never talk about it. I think we've all come to the realization that breaches in this type of contested environment are inevitable. They're going to happen. The question isn't did we prevent them. The question is did we survive and maintain functional during that breach. And I think we're getting better at defining survivability in contested environments, understanding that it's not just you're secure, you're breached. That doesn't exist anymore. We all live in contested environments right now. And as we've seen more kinetic activity, as we saw Russia invading Ukraine and the Iranian conflict really blend technical and kinetic activity into really one remit for the adversary, we have to be comfortable talking more about the technical side, because there is not a kinetic or physical event that's going to happen without some form of cyber reconnaissance. And that's, again, why the open source component is so important.
That's Garen Lacey, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and Technology Security at the State Department. You also heard from Eric Miller, a Senior Advisor for Open Source Intelligence at the Defense Intelligence Agency. You can find their full discussion with Federal News Network's Jason Miller at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Santaford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.